Thanks for stopping by to check out this episode of Vintage Audio Review. In this episode, guess what we're going to talk about? You guessed it, this McIntosh C22 tube preamplifier. McIntosh sold the C22 from 1963 to 1972 at a cost of about $279 or about $2,100 in today's money. I did a quick search on eBay, and this would be for the month of July 2023. I found several with prices ranging anywhere from $4,000 to $7,000 depending on the condition of the unit. It was rated at 0.2% to 0.02% THD depending on the amount of output voltage that the C22 was putting out, and its frequency response was listed as plus or minus 0.5 dB from 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz. We'll take a tour of the front and the back, and I'll pop it out of the case and kind of look inside just to see kind of what this one looks like. At this time that I'm doing this part of the video, I do not know whether this particular C22 has been serviced or not, so I'm kind of anxious to take it apart and see if indeed that it has been. And then of course there will be data and a final comment as far as my listening experience with the C22. So I thank you for tuning in, and hopefully you will find this entertaining and informative. Here is a close-up of the McIntosh C22. Starting on the left we have our balance control. I should point out that it does not have a center detent. Below those are our bass controls, and there's a control for each channel. You can hear them here. There is a detent for each change, and the way the bass control and the treble controls work is they are actually a switch with resistors soldered around them, so you have a very repeatable step and fairly low noise. Below that is our pan lock, this guy right here and this guy right here. You press those in, and then you can eventually get the case removed from the preamp itself. Here is our input selector, this guy right here, and we have selections for auxiliary, tape, tuner 1, tuner 2, phono 1, phono 2, and those are magnetic phono cartridges, as well as an input for a mic and a tape head. Now the tape head would be used where you were taking a signal from a tape recorder. I suppose it could be a reel-to-reel or maybe cassette that did not have its own preamp and you wanted to use the preamp of the C22. Below that, oh, and it has the little red indicator that changes as you move it. I believe that those are actually pilot lights with little red filters in front of them. They're not actually LEDs from what I could tell. Below that are some switches. So we have our power switch right here. Here is our tape monitor switch. And here, this one that says comp, RIAA or LP, that are two different equalization schemes for playing back records. Obviously, the one that we would care about today would be the RIAA. Next to that, we have our left tape and right tape inputs or outputs, and that is controlled by that function switch there. We also have, next to those, we have some filters. So we do have a rumble filter, a high frequency filter, and our loudness filter. Here are our treble controls, and those are just like the bass controls. They are switches with resistors around them. Here is our mode selector right here, and basically it lets you reverse the left and right channels, or you can take the right channel and put it to the left plus right channel, or you could take the left channel and put it to the left plus right channel. Back in the 60s and 70s you saw a lot of that. Also, here is our volume control. It's very smooth feeling, and we have our other pan lock there. So that's kind of the front of the McIntosh C22. This obviously is the rear of the C22 preamplifier. So starting here on the left, we have our switched AC outlets. There's 4 of them, and then we have one unswitched outlet right there, which predominantly would be used by your phonograph. We also have here and here the pan lock system, and we'll kind of see that in action in a little bit. We have a fuse here. Now these connections, they say they're from a power amp and then going to speakers. The manual talks about them being used to help with the phasing of your system. We have our phono ground lug here. Now I don't think this looks to me to be a regular screw. I don't think that's original, but it worked just fine when I had to connect the ground lead from a phonograph that I hooked up to this during my testing. Here is our left plus right RCA output, and that's supposed to be used to deliver a mono signal to a speaker in another room that is the sum of both what's on the left and right channels. We have our main preamplifier outputs, which are these two right here, and this is our tape output. Now the tape output is unaffected by your balance control, your bass or treble controls, or your volume control. So it's kind of just a buffered signal of whatever your input was selected. Here is our tape monitor input, and here is our auxiliary input. Here is another tape input. Here is our tuner 1 input and a tuner 2 input. We also have our phono 1 input and our phono 2 input, and those are looking for magnetic phono cartridges. We have our left and right mic inputs here, as well as our tape head inputs here, and both of those have shorting plugs on them. Now, what is going on behind here is, through these little holes are the tops of our tubes. I will go ahead and remove this, and you can see that we have our 6 12AX7 tubes. Earlier in the video, I think I said it had 12 AX7s, but it only has 6 12AX7 tubes. So that's kind of the tour of the backside of the McIntosh C22 preamplifier. Once I depressed the two pan lock buttons on the front and then pulled the preamplifier forward from the case, I was able to gain access to these controls here. And we'll start over on the left, and these two guys are for tape equalization. I'm guessing it's for when you use the tape head, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And I guess the one spot right here, which would be the National Association of Broadcasters position, that's marked. Here is our low frequency trim right here. And after I did some measurements on the frequency response, I discovered these controls, and I went in and adjusted them to make the frequency response flatter, and you will see that in the data. Here are our output levels to help add a fine tuning to your balance control, as well as an output level for the left and right. And we also have a phase switch right here where we have the normal, which is where it's normally set, or 180 degrees reverse phase if we set it over here. And then we have a pilot lamp intensity, and it's set for dim or bright, and right now it's set for bright. Now I'm going to be pulling this preamp out, and in order to do that there are two tabs on the side that have to be pressed in. I'll see if I can show one of them. There's one right here and one on the other side, and you just press those in, and then the preamplifier can be removed from the case. So I'm going to take some screws apart, and we'll look inside and just kind of see if this guy has been refurbed or not. Here is the inside of the C22, looking down from the top with the cover removed, and it's pretty apparent that this has been refurbished. You can see this capacitor here and this capacitor right here are new capacitors, and these capacitors here are all high quality newer capacitors. This capacitor in this can, I think you can just see it over here, that is actually a replacement that you could find that would replace the original can capacitor that went in this McIntosh. And if you look around here and around here, you can see that they cut the original capacitors and stuffed replacement capacitors inside here so that they could keep the overall look of having the original canned capacitors in it. So it looks like they did a rather nice job with the refurb of this C22. I'm not going to look at the view from the bottom side just because this kind of tells me all that I need to know that indeed this has been refurbished at some point. Here is the standard SNR THD plot at 1 kilohertz with the C22 preamplifier set for 0 dB of gain with 2 volts going in and 2 volts going out. You can see the SNRs are above 80 dB and the THD is better than, we'll say, 0.02%. Also, the THD plus noise is in the upper 70s, so it's looking pretty good so far. You can also see that the even harmonic, this would be the second harmonic, is higher than the third harmonic. So here is the harmonic plot, and you can see that the even harmonics, the second one, are higher than the third harmonics, which is kind of what you expect with tube gear. Once again, here's the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the C22 putting out 3 volts, and the reason for this is there is a specification for a 3 volt output. Now we are putting in 2 volts going in, so our gain is about 4 dB. The spec is that the THD should be less than 0.02% at 3 volts, and we are basically meeting that if you rounded this guy up. So that's pretty darn good for a preamplifier that is as old as this guy is, and you can tell that the SNRs are above 80, so everything's looking really nice on this preamp. Here we have the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the C22's gain adjusted for about 10.5 dB in order to get 10 volts output from the preamp. Also, the input signal level was raised from 6 dBV to 9.5 dBV. And what you can see that's going on is the red trace, the right channel. The noise floor seems to be fluctuating a bit. It seems to have stable down for the moment, but this is hitting the limits of the capabilities of the amplifier, and the reason I wanted 10 volts output is McIntosh had a spec that distortion would be less than 0.2% at 10 volts output, and we are better than 0.2%. And actually, at least for the left channel, the SNR is looking pretty good, although the THD plus noise has changed quite a bit from where it was at 2 volts output. Also, you can see that the harmonics have increased here, and we'll bring up our harmonic graph. And here we have the harmonics, and you can tell that the level of the harmonics has increased from where it was with the 2 volt in, 2 volt output case. In this case, our second harmonic, the even harmonic, is still just a little bit higher than the odd harmonic, the third harmonic. This plot shows the frequency response of the C22 from 10 Hz to 40 kilohertz with it set for 2 volts in and 2 volts out. Now, if we focus on just the area from 20 Hertz, which would be everything from here on up to 20 kilohertz, which would be everything to here. So if we just focused in on that range, you can see the channels are balanced within maybe 6/7 of a dB worst case, but our flatness is, we'll say the worst case flatness for the left channel is about maybe 1.8 dB, and for the right channel it's about 2.5 dB, and at the low end of the band and at the high end of the band at 20 kilohertz, they're both down. The right channel is a little bit better. It's down maybe 1.2 dB at 20 kilohertz, and the left channel is maybe down about 2 dB at 20 kilohertz. So it does not meet the plus or minus 0.5 dB requirement from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. I should also point out that I have been using the auxiliary input for all the measurements thus far. Here is the frequency response from 10 Hz to 40 kilohertz of the C22 with it set for 0 dB of gain and with a 2 volt input. The The difference between this and the earlier frequency response is that there is a hidden panel apparently on the C22 that is assessed once you depress the pan lock buttons in on the front, and then there's some little tabs on the side that you press, and you can pull the C22 out from the case, at which point you can see the controls. You'll see it in the video. There are a couple controls that I adjusted. The first was the low frequency trim to kind of get the bass more balanced, and there's adjustments for both the left and right channel. And then there is an output level adjustment for both the left and right channel, as well as the left plus right. But I didn't care about the left plus right. I just adjusted the left and right so that they were balanced. And you can see that the channels are very well balanced now, within probably 0.2 of a dB. Now our frequency response is basically plus 1.5 dB at the low end, and then down at worst case about 1.4 dB or 1.2 dB for the left channel, maybe 0.8 dB for the right channel down at the high end of the band at 20 kilohertz. So it has a much better frequency response now that those adjustments were made. Here is the C22's multi-tone test response, and it's showing distortion-free ranges depending on the frequency in the channel, the right channel not being nearly as good as the left channel, of between 10 to 15 bits of distortion-free range. This plot shows the isolation, or crosstalk as some people call it, between the auxiliary input to the tuner 1 output. In this case, the signal is applied to the auxiliary input, and the tuner 1 inputs are terminated into shorts, and the tuner 1 is selected. So what you're seeing is the signal that's on the auxiliary line bleeding over to the tuner 1 line. And you would like that signal to be as small as possible, as negative as possible. And we are seeing anywhere from, let's say 52 dB to as much as 90 dB of isolation between the two paths. This plot shows the C22's crosstalk for the left and right channels for the auxiliary input. In this case, the signal was applied to the left channel and the right channel was terminated into a short, and we are seeing better than 36 dB at the low end of isolation or crosstalk between the left and right channels to as much as about, we'll call it 59 dB. And there was no specification as to the level of acceptable crosstalk between channels. Here we are looking at the noise floor of the C22 preamplifier. In this case, the auxiliary input has been selected and its inputs are terminated into shorts, and we're just looking at the noise floor. You can see the largest contribution to the noise floor is the 60 Hertz power supply hum, which is right here, and it is below 100 dB down. So it's looking pretty good. For the most part, the noise floor is better than 120 dB. This plot shows the THD versus frequency for several different input power levels, which are in dBV, for the auxiliary input. And the worst case THD would be here less than 100 Hertz, say, and that would be 0.2%. And once we get to, say, 100 Hertz, we're at 0.1%, and then it gets better from there on. This plot shows the effect of various filters and tone controls on the C22. This big blue line here in the center is with everything set flat. There is a spec in that the treble and bass controls should affect things by plus or minus 20 dB. Our bass control is about maybe 21 dB, 22 dB here at the positive end, and about 20 dB cut at the negative end. Our treble maximum is maybe 16 dB, and the treble minimum is about 20 dB. So overall, that's a pretty good match. The rumble filter is supposed to have a 50 Hertz cutoff. So our rumble filter is this guy. So at 50 Hertz, he is down about, 12 to 13 dB. So that looks pretty reasonable. The high filter has a 5000 Hertz cut off, and that's this blue line right here. So the high filter is only down about 2 dB at 5 kilohertz, so it's you'd really want it down a little bit further according to what the spec is, but still not so bad. So there wasn't really a specification for the loudness effect, but we've got about 10 dB at the low part of the band, and then it comes down to, it looks like, just a few dB of loss at the high end of the band. So it basically just kind of boosts the bass area below maybe a kilohertz. Here's the 1 kilohertz THD SNR plot of the Phono 1 input stage. In this case, a 5 millivolt or minus 46 dBV signal is applied. The volume control is set for 0 dB gain. We are measuring out of the preamplifier outputs, and this right here is the gain of just the phono stage, so we're getting about 42 dB of gain. The SNRs are between 55 and 62 dB. Our THD is better than 0.03%, we'll call it, and the THD plus noise is anywhere from minus 62 to minus 55 dB. This is the frequency response of the Phono 1 stage with a 5 millivolt signal applied, and it's showing basically a plus 2 to maybe minus 1.6 dB flatness across the band. Now this is measured at the preamplifier output with the volume control adjusted for 0 dB of gain, and then you have the 42 dB or so gain of the phono stage. Here is the frequency response of the Phono 1 stage being measured at the tape monitor output rather than the preamplifier output, and it looks much flatter. It's maybe plus or minus 0.6 of a dB worst case, and the channels are balanced within a couple tenths of a dB. So definitely the main problem of the frequency response throughout this whole C22 has to be further along in the preamplifier stage, not the phono stage. For my listening test, I paired the C22 preamplifier with my Bryston 2B-LP solid state power amplifier, and the loudspeakers were my Wilson Watt 3 Puppy 2 speakers. I thought overall that this thing did a really good job. I would characterize the sound as being very warm and natural and clean. I didn't notice any noise when I had the volume at mid-range with the inputs to the auxiliary terminated into loads, and just listened to the speakers to see what was coming out of the combination of this and the power amp, and basically I really only heard the noise of the power amp, as I had auditioned to just the power amp before I connected the preamp up for the test. So it's very clean, and you could see that in the data that the noise floor was pretty low on this, and you don't have any of the 60 hertz hum really sneaking in causing havoc. So I thought that it did a really good job. When I connected it to the turntable and listened to a record which is probably 40 years old but is in fairly good shape, it sounded just fine. I didn't really have any problems with the frequency response of the phono stage. I thought it did a good job. The overall sound of this is really nice. If anything, it lacked maybe just a tad bit of detail or brightness. Now, I did have the treble controls turned up to +1, both of them for the left and right, to get a little bit more treble out of it. But it just seemed like it was the very high-end sparkle may have been off just a tad. Without having another preamplifier to A/B it, I couldn't say if that was just real or imaginary. But the sound was still great. I would love to have this on my shelf as something I could connect to every now and then, or very often. It just has a nice clean sound. I can understand why people seek these and pay a premium price for them. It's just a nice clean preamp, and it does most of what you want to do. So that being said, I would definitely recommend one of these if you're in the market for it, and this is a real nice addition to anyone's collection. I hope you have enjoyed this video and found it useful. If so, it would help if you click the like button. If you have not subscribed to the channel, that would be a good thing to do to help the channel grow. And once again, until next time, have a great day or night.